Hello everyone, welcome to the new episode of MSR Live. I am Mert and I will be your host. I hope everyone is safe and well. Today I have a very special guest that I am so much excited to have her here. Sarah Lynn will be with us today. Hi Sarah, welcome to MSR Live.
Hiya, how are you doing?
Thank you very much. Can you please introduce yourself? For example, what is your role at Microsoft?
Yep, so my role at Microsoft is a cloud advocate, and that's a kind of fun role. I really enjoy it. I've been doing it for just less than a year now, and part of my role is to look at creating blog posts that help people understand or decipher some of our products and how to use them and how you would integrate them with maybe your existing systems or how to introduce them into your existing systems as well. I also look to attend user groups and conferences and do things like this show to try and communicate with our audience and also get feedback. So the cloud advocates at Microsoft sit within the engineering team. So part of our role is to collect feedback, both good and bad, about our products, and then feed that back into the engineering team and hopefully either make products better or give the engineering team that kind of communication and be that conduit between our customers and our engineering team. So yeah, that's the cloud advocate role at Microsoft.
Okay, sounds very exciting. So you are the founder of the Glasgow Azure user group. Can you tell me about your community activities, please?
Yep, so about 3 or 4 years ago, I was starting to evaluate where I wanted my IT career to go. So things were starting to change. I was starting to see much more of Office 365 or Microsoft 365 as we call it nowadays. And people were starting to talk about cloud, talking about AWS and Azure. And I was at that pivotal point in my career where I was trying to decide you know, do I stay on-prem or do I start to look at where I can go with the cloud technologies? And when I started to look to learn this cloud technology and figure out how to integrate it and upskill myself, I found that there was no user groups or community activities within Scotland. There was a user group down in London, but that's a good, you know, a flight away or a good 8 hours on a train. So it was never going to be accessible for me. So ultimately, that's why I founded the Glasgow Azure user group, to give us a community up in Scotland where we could talk to each other and learn as we all figured out the cloud and tried to integrate that into our jobs. And ultimately, that's kind of where all my community activity has grown from, that idea of creating the community. I've become a public speaker, I've become much more active on social media and just kind of grown all the things that I do from that pivotal moment when I decided that I needed to learn the cloud and what it actually meant in my role. So that was a bit of a life-changing moment, just trying to do all that, and it's taken me off into a whole other world. And I really love the community interaction. Like if you'd met me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been this really shy person that wouldn't have come up to you, definitely wouldn't be doing this kind of live show and talking to you. But like I said, that whole community, that Glasgow Azure user group, has really given me the confidence and brought me out my shell, as we say here in Scotland, and just really loving the interaction, loving meeting new people, loving hearing their stories, and loving just sharing my knowledge and getting knowledge from the community as well.
Okay, so today our topic is Azure Migrate, and I want to ask you, what is Azure Migrate, or how Azure Migrate can help us to migrate our resources to the cloud, and how was the migration process before Azure Migrate?
Okay, so Azure Migrate, to start off, I am a total fangirl of Azure Migrate. I love the functionality and the facility that it gives us to go on that journey from being on-prem to the cloud. And it mirrors, like I said, just the journey I've had personally as well. So that's probably why I love it. But ultimately, what Azure Migrate allows you to do is look at your environment on-prem and then assess whether it's ready to move to the cloud, how much it's going to cost, how you would use it to migrate to the cloud, how you would actually migrate migrate to the cloud and just go on that journey. A lot of people think that Azure Migrate is a brand new product, but it's actually been around since September 2017. We announced it at Ignite that year, and it's grown in functionality. So when it first came out, it was literally just an assessment tool. So it would look at your environment, collect all your server details, the names, the IP addresses, and give you some kind of idea of what it would look like if you were to put it in Azure. But it's grown massively since then. So now we have the ability not only to look at just your server virtual machines, we can look at your VDI infrastructure, so your virtual desktops. We can look to move that into Azure. We can bring in, using some of our database migration tooling as well, we can link that in, and we can also now actually use Azure Migrate to do that lift and shift, to take a copy of your virtual machine and put it into Azure. Previously, before we had that capability, we were using either something like Azure Site Recovery or potentially a third-party tool, or doing our own kind of makeshift tool that would help us move our virtual machine up into Azure. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense and that explains what Azure Migrate actually is.
Okay, thank you. I'm a developer, so I have no experience in Azure Migrate. Yep. So I have made some investigation about it, and there are some tools for assessment or migration. Are these tools built by Microsoft, or are there any third-party tools we can use with Azure Migrate?
So there's kind of two tools under Azure Migrate. So there's Azure Migrate Server Assessment, which assesses all your servers, and then Azure Migrate Server Migration, which migrates your servers. Now, those two tools are made by Microsoft. They're first-party tools. As I said, there's third-party tools that we have. There's a bunch of them, and again, they can assess and migrate your workloads. They all have different kind of capabilities, and you do it slightly differently. Each sort of third-party tool, as you can imagine, does it slightly differently. But what we've done in our latest iteration of Azure Migrate is we've actually started to integrate those third-party tools, because what we were finding was customers were maybe leveraging our assessment capabilities, but they were leveraging a third-party tool that they maybe were already familiar with or had a partnership with to do the migration, and then it was becoming a mismatch. So you had to have the server assessment window open, you had to have that third-party tooling window open, and you know, nobody likes to be in multiple windows. We all like to have just one pane of glass, right, for the management. So what we've done is we've been able to leverage those third-party tools and bring in the data so that you can just go into the Azure Migrate portal and you can see all your third-party data and information and actually drive those tools from there. So instead of bookmarking all these different tools or having all them installed elsewhere, you can start to just leverage that, the one-stop shop being Azure Migrate and the Azure portal for that as well.
Okay, if you say to me a migration, and I'll say virtual machines. So what type of resources can I migrate to Azure? Just virtual machines, or are there any other stuff?
No, you could move anything to Azure. We have lots of capabilities. Servers are probably the things that we all have on-prem and we're very familiar with, but you could do that in a different way. You don't have to move them as servers into Azure. You can start to leverage some of our PaaS solutions. So if you had, say, for instance, a SQL Server database on-prem, you would have that on that traditional workload where it was a server and then you had the SQL install on top of it. But nobody likes to look after that because we have to look after the hardware, we have to patch the operating system, we have to secure the operating system, and then we have to look after SQL, etc. But if in that example, you could actually take the SQL Server database and move it into Azure just using one of our PaaS solutions, so using the Azure SQL database. And then that way, Microsoft take care of the underlying operating system, the underlying hardware, and all you need to do is secure the SQL and the data. Now, it's not necessarily as simple as I've made it out to be, but there is that migration purpose. So you don't have to take your servers as is. And equally, when you look at some of the developer technologies, if you have a website hosted on a server, you could take that code and potentially use it as a web app within Azure. So there's different migration paths. Some of them are a bit more manual. Some we have some tooling to help you with. But what Azure Migrate really helps you with is that lift and shift. So if you're taking your servers and wanting to host them as servers on Azure, you can use Azure Migrate to just do that lift and shift migration.
Okay, and there's another Microsoft product called Azure Site Recovery. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I know it's similar. Is it similar, or are there any difference between Azure Migrate and Site Recovery?
So there is a bit of confusion around this, to be honest, because previously when we had Azure Migrate, it was just that assessment tooling. So it just did that overview, it just interrogated your system. And in order to move your virtual machines and move your servers into Azure, you had to use Azure Site Recovery. Now, Azure Site Recovery is our disaster recovery tool. So it's the tool that we recommend customers use if they want to protect their site. So if they want to protect their on-prem virtual machines and then use Azure as their secondary site, or if they want to protect their Azure virtual machines in one region and then put them into another region if something went wrong. Azure Site Recovery would really be that tool that orchestrated that and set that all up for you. But for a while, we leveraged Azure Site Recovery to do that lift and shift. So we pretended that your on-site virtual machines were, potentially having an incident and then failing them over to Azure, and that was your migration path. That was the way we used Azure Site Recovery to migrate into Azure. But now that we've got Azure Migrate and it does that server migration for you, we're telling customers to use Azure Migrate because that's where our investment, that's where our research and development is going in terms of being able to migrate. So that's where you'll start to see some of the migration features you might want. They're two very different toolings. So Azure Migrate is for if you're migrating to Azure, and Azure Site Recovery is if you're wanting to protect and disaster recovery your virtual machines. Now, when you look under the hood of Azure Migrate server migration, it does actually leverage the Azure Site Recovery replication engine. So there is a bit of blurring of the lines, but really, if you are migrating, like I said, you should be using Azure Migrate. And if you're wanting to protect your workloads against a disaster happening, Azure Site Recovery is really the tool that you should be leveraging. I hope that answers your question and kind of makes sense.
Okay, thank you. So I wonder if Azure Migrate supports hybrid cloud scenarios.
Yeah, so Azure Migrate can help you in that hybrid scenario. So it can help you move your workloads, like I said, from on-prem into Azure. But if you have workloads in another cloud, such as AWS or GCP, you can actually use Azure Migrate to pull those virtual machines over to Azure if you wanted to. So I have had a few customers that have their on-prem virtual machines. They have had people put stuff in AWS on a credit card. They've even had people put stuff in Azure on a credit card. And part of the project is to try and bring all that together to either put it into one Azure subscription and move everything and suck everything into Azure, or bring it into parallel where they're using one cloud. So the hybrid is actually on-prem and Azure. So to bring all that together, they've used Azure Migrate to kind of, for lack of better terminology, suck everything into Azure and put it there. So we can support that hybrid model for you. Yeah, so that it helps you with that as well if you want to consolidate all the clouds that you have as well.
Okay, let's imagine I have a data center. I want to migrate to Azure. Are there any limitations like virtual machine size or something like that? I can migrate all of my stuff to cloud.
Pretty much, yeah. I think the limitations are more around your use cases. Sometimes it's not necessarily the best use case to put things into Azure, and other restrictions are probably around what you're going to pay for it. So sometimes a workload would actually be more expensive if you moved it into the cloud, depending on, if you wanted really powerful IOPS or GPU and graphic intense workloads. That's really only the real restrictions. Ultimately, you could move all your workloads into Azure, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense, like I said, because of that use case, or from the price point of view, right? There's no point. Especially, I've had some customers who have got a mixture of hardware in their data center. So they've got that legacy stuff, hardware that's maybe 3-5 years old and is coming to its end of life, but they also have hardware that they maybe bought a year ago and is more than capable of running the workloads, and obviously is just a year old, so it still has lots of shelf life left in it. It still has its warranty, it's still able to run. So we've been able to, move the workloads on the older hardware and leave stuff on-prem. So there are use cases, and you have to think about it. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense to move everything up into the cloud.
Okay, I have read something about agentless and agent-based migration. So what is agentless migration and what is agent-based, and what's the difference between them?
Okay, so to do a lot of the discovery and the migration, we need to install an agent on our servers that we're looking to either discover information around or migrate. And the agent just serves as that kind of collection, or just lets us into the server. But again, if you have 3,000 servers, installing an agent on each of those can either be really tiresome because you have to log on to every server, right? Or you have to script it, and then you have to troubleshoot because things don't just roll out easily, right? And we've also had customers who don't want to install agents on their servers because of audit reasons. They're a bit unsure. It's going to take months to get it through the change removal process. And that's why we've started to look at the agentless version. Now, the agentless version is really only available for VMware environments at the moment. It's still in preview, but the agentless is, as it says, it doesn't require an agent on your servers. So instead, it leverages the connection with your vCenter server within your VMware environment to collect the information and also to migrate your machines. And again, that's great for those customers, like I said, that don't want to install the agent, can't install the agent, or have a VMware environment that they can leverage. Again, it's still in preview at the moment. I'm hoping, I genuinely don't know what the product team are planning, but I'm hoping that agentless is going to be something that we can leverage in all environments and not just VMware environments.
Okay, as you said, the VMware, I want to ask you, does it support Azure VMware solutions?
Yep, so that's a recent addition. So we've recently just seen the capability released, and it's in preview as well, where you can assess your your VMware environment, and then price that specifically up to host within our new offering, which is in preview as well, the Azure VMware solution. So we've got the capability to look at it and then understand whether, again, that's the right move, what it would look like in terms of cost, and some compatibility as well around that. So that's a new feature that Azure Migrate has.
Okay, thank you. So I have no experience about this migrate stuff, so this may be a stupid question. While migrating to the Azure, what happens if something goes wrong? For example, I need to roll back something, or can I lose data? Something like that.
So yes, that's always a worry, regardless of whether you're moving your virtual machine to a data center, 20 miles or kilometers down the road. There's always that risk of something going wrong, right? There are ways to roll it back, potentially. There are possibilities you could lose data, but again, it depends on how you're migrating it, when you're migrating it, and what your workload is, right? If you have a workload that doesn't write any data to it at 3 AM in the morning, probably the best time to move it, right? So that way you're not going to lose any data. If something goes wrong during the migration, you ultimately have the virtual machine or the server still on-prem, so you could just roll back that way. So what a lot of customers do is shut down the virtual machine on-prem and then migrate it. And not to oversimplify it, but ultimately what you're doing with Azure Migrate is taking a big copy of that virtual machine and then just spinning it up, starting it up in Azure. So if something went wrong when you spun up in Azure, it wasn't working, services weren't starting, the data wasn't all there, or you couldn't connect into it, all you would do is shut down the Azure virtual machine and ultimately spin up the one on-prem and just point your users back to the one on-prem. You've not damaged it in any way. Like I said, oversimplifying it slightly here, it's a wee bit more complicated, but it's ultimately a copy and paste job you're doing. So there's nothing to stop you from utilising that on-prem virtual machine again if something didn't go right in the Azure world. Now, Azure Migrate has a test failover purpose in it, so hopefully you've used that before you actually do your live migration. And what the test one does is spin up your virtual machine in an isolated way that you can log onto it. So I can log onto that virtual machine as Sarah. I can check that the files are there. I can check if the services have started, if the software is there, if there's any software I need to install or uninstall once it's in the Azure world. And then once I'm happy that I've got all that test, the failover or the migration process down, and I know what I'm doing, I can delete that test virtual machine and then go ahead with the actual production migration. So in essence, you really shouldn't be surprised when you do the live and the production migration. Obviously, in the real world, it doesn't always happen as perfectly as that, but we can cover it. It's not it's broke. I'm going to have to work till all hours and my boss is going to be shouting at me. Fingers crossed, hopefully.
Okay. If I am using Azure Stack in my data center and I have decided to migrate my stuff to cloud, is it easier to migrate the Azure Stack or they are similar process?
I've never seen anybody move off of Azure Stack into Azure, to be honest. And that's just my personal experience. There probably has been customers that have moved off Azure Stack into Azure. I think if customers are using Azure Stack, there's probably a really good reason for them isolating their workloads and keeping it on-prem while still using the Azure capability. There's nothing to say that you couldn't migrate them. The process should be the same as if you're migrating from an on-prem bare metal or from a Hyper-V or VMware. The process should be the same. There shouldn't be any limitations. Probably one of the Azure Stack experts are going to come on and tell me I'm wrong, but ultimately I don't think there is. There's nothing to stop you because it's, again, oversimplifying it. It's just a virtual machine. If you're using that on Azure Stack, so you could lift and shift that up into Azure. There shouldn't be anything to stop you from doing that.
Okay, you say just an virtual machine, and I want to ask you if it's just a container or container orchestration. What Azure Migrate offers us for container stuff?
So there's nothing at the moment. I don't know if there's anything in the pipeline, but there's nothing at the moment that supports that container migration. And again, I'll be honest, from personal experience, I've not seen that many customers run containers on-prem. Usually if they're looking at containerizing something, they are looking at doing it net new within the cloud. So I don't personally have any asks for moving containers from on-prem into the cloud, but yeah, that's maybe something that if there is an ask, we can actually build into the product. So if anybody listening does have that migration path and wants that included in Azure Migrate, please drop us a chat note or ping me on Twitter or whatever and let me know, and we can speak to the product team.
Okay, thank you. So do you have something to show us today, like a simple demo or some slides?
So I've got a small demo actually of the I've lost my words again, Azure VMware solution within Azure Migrate. So let me share my screen for you. So So as I said, this is a new feature that we launched a couple of weeks ago now, and it's the ability to assess your VMware environment and get some information within Azure Migrate. So what we've done here is this is the Azure portal, and we're in the Azure Migrate blade. Now we've pulled in the data from our VMware environment, and we're going to have a look at what data it's pulled in and what it says our environment would look like if we were to host it in the Azure VMware solution. So we go into the assessment report and pull that up around our VMware environment. Now, I've got two assessment reports here, and I always recommend that customers do two, and they change the sizing criteria. So you'll see I've got one report that says the sizing is identical to what it looks like on-prem, and I've also got one that is based on performance. Now, we're probably all guilty of on-prem sizing things just that little bit bigger than probably necessary to give us the bit of comfort around what's happening, right? And make sure we're not getting tons of phone calls to our help desk because things are running slow. So what Azure Migrate can do is actually collect your performance data, so it can look at things like your CPU utilization, your memory utilization, disk utilization, etc., and suggest an appropriate size for your virtual machine in Azure. So it can actually either report a downgrade of size within Azure, or even to maybe need to increase that size. So I always say to run two reports to give you that comparison, both from the sizing point of view and also cost, because if we were sizing everything dependent on its performance, we might actually save some money. So that's why we've got two reports. What we're going to look at is the performance-based one around this environment within our VMware, and see what it would look like if we were to move it to the new service, the Azure VMware solution. So we've got a couple of informational screens here. We've got cost and we've got readiness. Now the cost shows us what it would cost us monthly, and it also shows us here on the average cost per virtual machine, and these prices are in US dollars. We've also got a kind of readiness state for our virtual machines within the AVS solution as well. We can see that the majority of our virtual machines are actually ready with conditions. So there's something that we have to have a look at and think about before we actually were to move to AVS as well. And we've also got more utilization information if we scroll down around what AVS nodes and how much we would actually be using it. And this is more around the sizing and how many you would actually start to purchase when you looked at the AVS solution as well. But what we want to do is actually look at why these virtual machines are tagged as ready but with conditions, and what we would have to think about. So you can see them all here with the kind of orange triangle up beside them. And what it's actually telling us is these virtual machines, when we go into it, we can see here the reason. It says that this virtual machine has IPv6 detected on it. Now, at the moment, AVS doesn't support IPv6. So there's potentially something we would need to do around this virtual machine if we were to move it to the AVS solution. And that's really all that is. It potentially could have been that it's flagged as saying that an operating system version isn't supported. You know, if you were looking at something really legacy, like Windows 2000 or Windows NT, it could have flagged up here that the operating system was really old and potentially wouldn't be supported on that solution as well. So some of the reasons are genuine and legit. You shouldn't be running something as old as Windows Server 2000 anymore. But you know, other reasons could be that you need to re-IP address it as well. What you can also see here is the breakdown of the CPU utilization, the memory size, the memory utilization, and that's the information that Azure Migrate is using to base its performance sizing on, and that's where we get that sizing criteria from. It's had a look at it over you know, the day or the 30 days or the 3 months or whatever time period you've had Azure Migrate in your environment and collecting the information from and sizing it appropriate from there as well. So that's just a quick overview of what the assessment report would look like for AVS and kind of having a look at it. So yeah, is there any questions around that?
Okay, I have a question before the audience. There was an update released on last month. So what is new on the update?
So with the update, that was what we got with the AVS. So the assessment of the AVS solution was one of the things we got. We also got the ability to put in multiple credentials when we're looking at our physical servers. So before, you could only put in one credential set. So you could only put in one username and password to assess all of your physical servers. Now, again, in a perfect environment, we would have one set of credentials that we could log on to every server with. Doesn't always work that way. There's always one server lurking in the corner with an old username or used password. So the Azure Migrate physical appliance now allows us to add in multiple credentials. So if you had potentially 3 or 4 different accounts that sometimes you use to log on these servers, you could put them in and then be able to go out and have a look at them. So that was really what was in the June update, to be honest. So obviously the big one was the ability to assess our VMware environments to look at what it would look like in the AVS solution.
Okay, so can you give any spoilers about the further updates?
Unfortunately not. The product team have not told me what is on the roadmap. I wish they had. That would make my life a little bit easier. But no, unfortunately, I don't have any spoilers. And yeah, I'd probably get sacked if I did have spoilers and gave you some, unfortunately. So apologies for that.
Okay, no worries. So I have left the hardest question to the end.
Okay.
Okay, so also this is from a friend of mine. How advanced cloud economics cost modeling should be done?
So the pricing question is always one that I get. What I say to customers around that is a couple of things. So when you're doing the assessment, like I said earlier, do that two types of assessment. Do one based on what you're doing, you running it as is, and then one on the performance. And then you can actually see a comparison of whether you started to right size things, what that cost would look like. What I tend to see with customers is they end up somewhere in the middle of those two reports with their costs, because some things will need change size-wise and others won't. The other tool to look at when you're assessing your environment and trying to figure out the cost is the total cost of ownership calculator that we have. And that allows you to put in what your current costs are, what your current environment looks like, and then potentially look at what it would be like in Azure. And again, it gives you some great pointers to talk about and think about in terms of costing it. A lot of people don't have information around what their current data center provides them, because it may be just a basement in their office that they're running, and the electricity costs are all built into the whole building and no one sees anything like that. But that is something that you have to think about, and the total cost of ownership can help you fill in some of those blanks, because we've taken data from other customers and filled in that and made some assumptions around that, so it can help you. And that's pricing and trying to figure out the cost of it before you move to Azure Migrate, before you move into Azure. Once you've moved into Azure, we have great tools built into the platform that can help you deal with the costs. The first one is the Azure cost management tool that can help you see what's happening within your environment in a graphical way. You can jump on and have a look at where your projected costs are, how you're spending it, what resource groups, what resource types are being the big hitters. That way you can start to, potentially shout at someone in your organization if there's a user group that says Sarah's test user group, resource group, and it's costing, $1,000 every month. You can hunt that person down and deal with that. There are other things like you can set up budget alerts so that you can be alerted if your budget was running out. And we also have Azure Advisor, which helps you understand what your workloads are doing, not just from a cost point of view, but from security and performance as well. And Azure Advisor can really help you understand, again, right sizing things, either sizing them down, sizing them up, shutting things down that are running idly, unattached things like a public IP address that's been left, that hasn't been deleted and is costing you money. So there's different tooling that you can use before and after you actually move to Azure. What I would say is customers get caught up sometimes in the cost, and I've seen customers over-index on saving money every month. And what they do is they actually cause themselves a little bit too much harm, because they're constantly looking at the cost report and going, oh no, that's too much money, I need to save some money. And they spin down services, they downgrade their virtual machines to a smaller size, and then they'll hit something along the road where they actually needed that more CPU, that more memory utilisation, or the disk usage, and they get help desk calls going, the workload's running really slow, this cloud is rubbish, we need to move off it. And it becomes this horrible cycle, and then they have to spin that virtual machine back up to a larger size, and then the budget goes through the roof again, and they go, what's happening? And they just get caught in this really evil cycle. So what I tell customers is, don't over-index on the cost. Look at it maybe every 2 months, every quarter during your financial year, maybe even every 6 months, depending on where you are and how much services you've got in, and do the optimization then. That way you've got a set of data from 2 months, 3 months, 6 months that you can actually base your performance on. So you can say, well, we actually do need to run that virtual machine really heavily because of some workloads that spike during every Wednesday of the month. Or you can start to say, well, it only spikes once a month. So what we could do is downsize that virtual machine. Then we could set up an automation runbook so that stops the virtual machine, spins it up to a larger size to accommodate that spike, and then shuts it down and puts it back at the smaller size, all automatically, not by manually doing it, but you've got that data and you can start to look at it. So there are things you can do, but please don't get caught up in the costs. I know it can be scary sometimes when you spend in the cloud. I've run up some bills myself on my personal credit card, but I think it's more around when you start to think about designing the systems and start to leverage them, you'll start to get the benefit of it. And as your maturity grows within the cloud, automatically when you architect things, you'll start to think about the costs. You'll start to think about, well, do I really need all these virtual networks? Do I need to have virtual peering? Do I have to have things in different regions? Can I live without disaster recovery on some of your workloads and save some money that way? Because again, we all protect everything. Everything is protected. Everything has got to be up 99.9999% of the time. Potentially there are workloads that you don't need. I remember having an argument once on a customer site. They had a server that hosted SharePoint, and it was supposed to be this big project, and it was supposed to be this huge big SharePoint installation. Ultimately, what that SharePoint site actually ended up doing was hosting the canteen or the restaurant menu for everybody so as they could check what their lunch menu was. And I was like, we don't need to back this up. We don't have to have disaster recovery on it because it's not mission critical. No one is going to really scream at us if they can't see what the menu is because they could just walk to the canteen. And that way we actually saved some data. We saved backing up that server, we saved some space on our tape drives. And that's the kind of thing you maybe need to think about when you're architecting in Azure as well. Does everything necessarily need to be protected and backed up? And that kind of thing. That's where you start to think about and start to be a bit more clever, and ultimately the cost savings will come. That was a really long answer to your question. Does that make sense though? Does that help?
Yes, thank you. So do we have any other questions from the audience?
Have they all gone shy?
Okay, let's wait a couple of seconds. So while we are waiting, thank you very much, Sarah. I have no idea what Azure Migrate is before this session, but now I can say I know it very well. So with your permission, I want to publish this recording to YouTube for the people who missed or want to watch it again. Yep. And I hope have you on MS Out Live again later.
Yep, it was really good fun. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if you can. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have no questions. Okay, thank you very much again, Sarah.
Okay.
It's a great experience to have you here. So
Awesome.
see you.
Thank you.
Bye. Cheers.